It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Samantha Ward. Sam is an Associate Professor of Zoo Animal Welfare at Nottingham Trent University. Sam has been in this industry for a good few years now and has contributed to multiple zoo industry textbooks and journal articles. And she relatively recently co-edited the book Zoo Animal Learning and Training. I'll drop the link in the chat to that in a minute. Sam currently sits as a welfare expert advising the UK government on UK zoo matters, and she's been involved in updating the very recent changes to zoo licensing legislation in the UK. Sam is also a committee member of the Animal Records Working Group for the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, and she's the research advisor for the charity Wild Welfare. Sam's got lots of practical zoo industry experience, as well as also having a really strong academic standing in research. And her current research aims to improve captive animal welfare, focusing very much on zoo animal behaviour and welfare, looking at zoo animal husbandry and management techniques, including animal training and human-animal interactions. And that's what Sam's going to talk to us about today. So we're going to be talking about the importance of those human-animal interactions for zoo animal welfare. Thank you, Sam. Over to you.
Thanks ever so much. Just checking you can still hear me okay. I'm assuming you will, and if not, you'll tell me. Perfect. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Ellen. I can't see if anyone's got cameras or anything on, so I'm just going to get started. But, oh, hang on. Am I going to? There we go. As Ellen's just wonderfully introduced me, I don't need to talk about any of this. So basically what Ellen's just said is essentially all in this slide. So yeah, I'm going to be talking to you today about one of my favourite topics, which is human-animal interactions in the zoo. So some of you might be aware of my work. Some of you might be aware of these, have reused a few of these slides because I think some of them are quite integral to understanding what human-animal interactions are, and certainly within a zoo perspective. So this is your typical zoo. As you can see, there's lots of potential for interactions depending upon the enclosure, depending upon the zoo's ethos for education or interaction. So we have our standard sort of zoo enclosure with our glass fronted windows where you'll have various different crowds. And although we might think as a visitor, we don't necessarily have any interaction through these glass windows, that is probably interpreted very differently by the animals that might be on the other side of these. Again, you can see there's variations in, being able to hold animals, touch animals, feed animals, or walk through in animal spaces. And so all of these have the potential to influence the animal's behaviour and welfare, and also the interactions that we might feel as a member of the public. So what is a human-animal interaction? So back in the early or mid 70s and early 2000s, there was a definition that was based on child psychology, and this was based on humans. And it was more to sort of human, what is a human interaction? And so essentially what we've done in the animal world and animal sciences is just switch out one human for an animal, which you may agree with or you may not. And so essentially it's where human A will perform something. It could be visual, it could be sensory, it could be anything of those different techniques that we might employ to interact with an animal. And then it might have some impact or change on the behavior. And so this is essentially the underarching or overarching definition, shall I say, of what is a human-animal interaction. So again, if we think back to those images, we can certainly see that, there are lots of potential different interactions that are occurring here. And there's lots of potential for the various different valences of welfare as well within these different situations. And that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about this afternoon. So where did it all start? So I suppose you could say the OG of human-animal interactions is this guy here, Heini Hedegaard, who is a German researcher who started to propose various different hypotheses as to, what are the impact of of visitors on zoo animals. And he proposed back in his book in 1969 that zoo animals will perceive people as either as prey, as symbiont, as an enemy, as part of the inanimate environment, or as a member of the same species. Now, these were not sort of research tested hypotheses. These were just kind of, what are the options? What might Heini Hedegaard actually propose, or how might the animals perceive people? What are the various different possibilities? And it wasn't until 2013, when the second OG of human-animal interactions, 𝗦𝗺𝗵𝗁, actually published a paper on revisiting Heidegger. And this paper is again really useful, really interesting. Basically, Jeff collected lots and lots of the publications that whether that was in white papers, scientific peer-reviewed articles, newspapers, whatever he could find where somewhere it was documented that there was some form of interaction between a human and an animal in the zoo. And he was able to then tabulate and look into all of these various different options of where there's evidence to suggest what those hypotheses might be. And so essentially he was able to see that there was evidence pointing to animals seeing us as an enemy, there we go, sorry, as a member of the same species, as part of the inanimate environment, or as an enemy. And so essentially this kind of emphasised this push towards the idea of positive, neutral, or negative interactions. That's what we see in the literature quite commonly today. Now, with people in zoos, we get two varieties, shall we say. So we have the unfamiliar zoo visitors who will be there and be changeable. There'll be different people, different behaviours, different age groups, different all sorts of varieties of different types of people that the animal might see on a daily basis. And this is very interchangeable. Although you do get your common regular visitors that will go maybe once a week, maybe they'll go a couple of times a week. The general visitor will be going to a zoo, maybe once a year if you're lucky, or maybe even fewer and far between. So the likelihood of repeated interactions with those particular people and animals is very, very limited. We also have our familiar people in zoos, so our staff. So again, they might be zookeepers, they might be vets, they could be zoo staff, they could be education, they could be talk providers, whatever it might be, but they will be people that the animals are able to recognise. And it is important, I think, at this point to say that there is evidence of animals being able to recognise humans, and this is animals within zoos. So there have been a couple of studies that I can share with the references at a later point to show that animals are able to actually distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar people, so people that they see regularly or not. So this is really important when we come to look at what the impact of humans are on animals in zoos. So I'm going to focus first on this visitor component, so this unfamiliar human, and then the second half of the presentation is then going to focus on the familiar people, then the keepers and the staff. So the visitor effect is something that, again, has been around for quite some time, originally published back in the 1980s, again, more later, and then more commonly even since then. Zoo research does seem to go through massive trends. Environmental enrichment was one trend where, every single publication that you were reading about was about environmental enrichment. It's then kind of been through this trend of visitor-animal interactions. And one of the reasons why the visitor effect is a nice, easy, or a very common topic to study in zoos is because you don't necessarily need to manipulate anything. Okay, you always get some level of visitors and you can always monitor the behavior of your animals. You might want to go a little bit into more depth and think about the physiology side of things, but certainly the behavioral aspect of monitoring the visitor effect is really quite straightforward. So much so that, again, certainly been working in a university, we have quite a lot of students, undergraduate students, master's students that want to go away and work and do research in zoos, and this is one of the topics that they generally like to sort of pick up on. So there have been, as I've mentioned, lots of empirical studies since the 1980s with very ambiguous results. Some of them where animals might respond negatively to visitors, and this doesn't always mean aggressively. It just means that they're not interested. They don't want the visitors to be there. They're going to ignore them and they're not going to kind of engage with them in any way, shape or form, like this image at the top here. It could be that animals will interact positively with visitors or be affected positively. So again, in this particular image, you can see that the orangutan is quite engaged with the child, and this does happen quite a lot with some different species, with quite a variety of different species. And it might be that they ignore visitors, so they just carry on with their days. They just completely don't even notice that the visitors are there. So like I've mentioned, there are multiple different studies that have investigated all of these. And one of the biggest criticisms with regards to a lot of these research papers is that essentially you're comparing kind of behaviours with humans when there's low numbers and then when there's high numbers, or even medium and high numbers, but actually there's still visitors there. So I was actually part of a team of people led by Ellen, who you've just been seeing and hearing from, who was actually kick-started the idea of looking into this when we've got the COVID closures at various different zoos. So although COVID was pretty horrific for lots of zoos for mainly financial reasons, it did mean that there was the opportunity to be able to study the visitor effect through with having no visitors whatsoever. So daily routine for the animals was pretty much exactly the same. The keepers were still there. They were still being fed. The animals were still being fed. The keepers probably were too. But essentially they were, having their daily ongoings within their enclosures, but actually with no visitors whatsoever. So this gave us a really nice opportunity to be able to investigate what was going on with those animals. And again, there's quite a few publications that now look at this. So Ellen and I and a few of the other co-authors here have been part of quite a few of these. And then hopefully there's some of the others that are on the call as well that were part of these papers, involved keepers collecting the behavioural data and in some instances fecal samples. So we were able to do cortisol levels in fecals, and we can actually then monitor how this impacted as the public went from 0 in zoos to kind of increased numbers and then further increased to normal back to normal visitor numbers again. So it's again looking at various different species. One of the popular ones that really grabbed the media's attention, certainly in the United Kingdom, was this paper that I've shared here. This one was about primates, and we also were able to look at fecal glucocorticoids for this particular paper as well. And essentially it was showing that, although, lockdown was not great for humans, it also potentially wasn't that great for a lot of our, certainly the bonobos and the gorillas and the chimps in these situations as well. So this was a really interesting paper for us to be involved with. And it was certainly one that the press really enjoyed and really liked to kind of get out there, which also showed the zoos in quite a positive light, in the fact that when the zoos reopened, the bonobos and the gorillas spent less time alone. They were more engaged with enrichment because they were kind of maybe in that more usual space, and they also olive baboons performed less sexual behaviors and dominance behaviors, which of course as soon as you mention sex, the media are like, woohoo, let's go on to this paper. So as I've said, there's quite a lot of papers out there now, so much so that there's also been, when I can get the next slide, there we go, several different reviews over the past 20 years. So there was a review from early 2000s, 2007, 17, 19, a book that I was involved in, a book chapter within 2019, and then even a more recent review in 2023. Now, one of the problems with these reviews is that none of them actually kind of provide a quantitative analysis. So it's all very qualitative, and not that I'm against qualitative data, but it's quite difficult to actually understand the real in-depth understanding, I suppose, of what those data are trying to show and how we can move forward with this evidence. Okay, sorry. So when we're thinking about visitor-animal interactions, and when we think back to that original paper of that positive, neutral, or negative viewpoint towards the visitors, then it was showing that there's really a lot of variation. And a lot of those variations were dependent upon enclosure design, the weather and the climate, and also the individual animal response, which if you're trying to utilize the data to be able to provide evidence-based management decisions on how to maybe design enclosures, how to actually, provide well for your animals, it becomes very difficult to actually utilize those information to be able to take that next step. So more recently, I was part of, again, a team. So Jeff and Vicky Melfi both very well-established researchers and professors now in zoo research. So we worked on a paper that was specifically focused on zoo-housed primates. Now, this was initially for a book, but we decided that actually we wanted to kind of, science it up a little bit more so than just have it as a textbook. And so we published a paper as well with the information. So I've shared the paper here. And if anyone does want a copy of that, I'm more than happy to share it. So get in touch with me, or it is on ResearchGate if you want to have a look. This one isn't open access, unfortunately. But what we wanted to look at was actually, can we use the data that's been published based on the primates and visitors and be able to kind of put forward some really strong recommendations as to how to move forwards to make sure that we're providing a better life for our primates because of visitor effect. So we proposed 4 different hypotheses. We wanted to investigate if there were biological or ecological variables that impacted on their response rates or their responses to visitors. So this was generally focused on the size of the primate and also whether they were terrestrial or arboreal. We wanted to focus on the enclosure variables. So did they have access to inside and outside? Did they have, was it a walk-through enclosure? Was it an enclosed environment? So what sorts of types of enclosures were the animals in? What were the visitor variables that were measured? So was it noise levels? Was it the number of visitors? And so on and so forth. And then we wanted to focus on those individual variables. So what is it about an individual animal that might be able to change its way or change its response to the visitors? And for this, we focused on gorilla, mainly because there was the only gorilla that had got multiple publications that were looking at similar sorts of things. A lot of the other primates, it was maybe one study on cotton-top tamarins, one study on olive baboons, and so we wanted to kind of try and build in a bigger case study for the individual components. So we were able to gather data from 106 different primate groups found in 57 different publications, and these were of 44 different primate species across 10 different families. So quite a broad spectrum of primates that are studied, and we found that realistically of all of the literature, primates were the most predominantly studied taxonomic group. So just quickly, the results. We found for the biological and the ecological variables that small arboreal primates were affected more negatively by visitors. And so what we were looking at here is, as you can see from the graph here, a lot of them still had positive and maybe neutral or negative effects that were documented in the various different papers, but actually it's the change in that positive to negative or negative to unaffected that we were actually interested in, which shows that they had a more significant negative impact by the visitors compared to others. So if they were still able to see some positive or some unaffected behaviours, then it's not necessarily as negative as opposed to just a negative response from the visitors. So it was those small arboreal primates, cotton-top tamarins and the likes of those sorts of types of callitrichids that were really affected negatively by the members of the public. When it came to enclosure variables, again, there were more positive and neutral responses in walk-through and semi-free range enclosures. So as you can see here, there were no negative responses seen in these 2 types of enclosures. And so this was something that we could really think about in terms of moving things forward, trying to maybe even blend in those smaller primates into these semi-free range or walk-through enclosures to be able to mitigate those negative responses a little bit more so. They're also not so dangerous either compared to maybe your larger primates, so it might work quite nicely for walk-through or semi-free range enclosure design. We also did find that enclosure size made no difference to the behavioural responses whatsoever. So it didn't matter whether you had a really massive enclosure or not. Basically, the variation still included maybe a range of positive, unaffected, or so neutral and negative responses. So size made no difference. And we put that down to the fact that generally, certainly within the publications, the amount of space that were provided was relevant or required the right required amount for the animals that were housed there, so that it wasn't like a stocking density issue, which then created more negative responses for the animals. For the third hypothesis, we looked at, like I say, those visitor variables. And again, the graph here shows that actually it's the visitor noise that created more negative responses. So again, if we're thinking about how to design exhibits, we might want to think about how we can try and mitigate noise. And also maybe even if we've got enclosures where we're kind of set in design, we might want to think about how we can kind of try and encourage more quieter visitation, whether that's various different techniques, whether staff members are standing there, or whether that's maybe linked more to, providing some levels of music to try and engage people into being a little bit more quiet in that way. The final hypothesis was focused on the individual variables, and unfortunately, I'm afraid it wasn't any more clear than what was currently out there. So we found that age, which was supposed to be a significant factor because of potentially linked to experience of visitors, wasn't significant on its own. So what we wanted to look at was a regression model to see if there was various different other elements and variables that had a significant impact on the response of the animals. So we did find a significant model, and this presented 40.4% of the variance in the responses of the animals. However, none of the predictor variables on their own were actually shown to be significant, which essentially means that it is the combined impact of, for example, in this case, age, sex, group size, enclosure size, and enclosure type that were all integrated. And this was the best model that we could find. If we specifically just used age, sex, and group size, which are more linked to the more individual variables, then actually the model was a lot worse. And so it wasn't really that useful. So we still need to do a lot more work into this idea of what are the individual variables, and, is it even quantifiable within the space of research because of the needs for, repeated N numbers and so on and so forth. So we might need to just focus in on particular individuals and try and kind of adapt the requirements and what we provide for those particular individuals if they are having negative responses to visitors. But what about the non-primates? So again, Ellen, Jeff and I and another researcher, Violet, were involved in the same book for a different chapter focusing on non-primates. But again, we wanted to try and get this out there in a little bit more of a scientific tone. So this paper is open access, so you do have access to this. Again, the media quite liked this particular paper. It did show, I think, quite a positive spin on elephants' responses to visitors in quite a positive light. So again, we had quite a lot of positive press from this particular release of paper. So in summary, with regards to the non-primates, we wanted to look at what were the effects of the zoo visitors on non-primate species, and if there was particular trends across taxa to enable us to evaluate different types of animal-based welfare measures that were used. So we found 105 peer-reviewed studies, and these covered 252 non-primate species, so mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrates. And again, just I suppose a summary of the overall results. For more details, you can go in and have a look at the paper. But for ease, I've just kind of summarized some of these figures here. So we looked at, this was the split. So we've got predominantly mammals, next birds, then reptiles, fish, amphibians, and invertebrates. So again, there always seems to be this bias towards research with regards to mammals. I mean, I was also involved in a book chapter that was looking at, do we focus too much research on mammals? But I think in essence, it's really important to remember that, mammals are the predominant animals that are housed in zoos. So actually, we maybe need to match the same amount of research onto the same number of animals that are housed if we're going to do it systematically. But also it's an animal that we are able to kind of lean in from the previous studies, so we can learn a lot more. So and as we found certainly with the primate paper with the gorilla, if we only have one paper on one species and we move the same paper onto a different species, and actually it can be quite difficult to draw any real conclusions from this. So maybe studying the similar individuals or similar mammals or similar birds, whatever it might be, is actually quite beneficial to allow us to these zoomed out viewpoints of whatever it is that we're trying to investigate. So as you can see, mammals were predominant, and that's kind of expected in my mind, as to why, and makes sense. But also, I think certainly from the review that we looked at, and all of the different papers, we found that predominantly the responses of the visitors was more neutral. So I think certainly my take before we got involved in this research was that actually visitors might have quite a negative viewpoint, and I think that's always what we kind of think is that we're disturbing their environment, we're disturbing their peace, we're kind of maybe trying to knock on the windows and so on, so much. So I think this was a little bit surprising, but also quite positive result for me from this particular review. That actually visitors, the animals in zoos are quite used to humans now. There are some obviously that are maybe negative responses, maybe unclear, but actually if we do keep this kind of high level of neutral and maybe try and increase the positive a little bit, then actually we're not doing too badly with our design of enclosures and so forth. When we deep dive a little bit more, when we're again looking at that sort of taxonomic level, amphibians did seem to show more negative responses. Again, this is probably limited because of the number of papers that were involved in this. Birds and fish were more likely to show neutral or unknown responses. And again, this goes to show the importance of trying to understand, what is good welfare or bad welfare for birds and fish. They're very limited in terms of their knowledge. We're limited in terms of their knowledge for welfare indicators. So again, this kind of result goes to show that maybe we do need to try and increase a little bit more to be able to widen that response. And again, most studies were mammals, and the responses varied quite widely. So the types of measures that were used most commonly, as I've mentioned, was behavioural measures. So this was things like activity budgets, enclosure use, stereotypies. And again, these are realistically the quite easy, low-hanging fruit data that you can collect, and also undergraduates can collect as well. Physiological were less common. Cortisol levels, there are increasingly concerning reports of using cortisol levels these days, how it's more of an indicator of energy expenditure. So it might be positive, it might be negative. So just a cortisol on its own is quite a difficult measure to understand. And also quite timely. So it depends on how you collect that cortisol as well. And physical aspects like body conditioning scores were rarely used. And I think this is more likely because it's not necessarily a direct welfare measure over a short-term period. So it might be that it's, maybe over a week or a month, depending, of course, on your species. But from these papers and from this review, we were able to put forward some recommendations, which was our goal, to try and encourage researchers that are still researching in this area and still working in this area and certainly people that are working within zoos, to try and use meaningful and species-specific welfare indicators where possible. So it might be that you're, utilising ones that have already been published, maybe using some of those papers that we've used in that review to kind of pull down really useful measures to be able to indicate welfare. Trying to employ some more sort of controlled experimental designs. Now, we're not recommending closing zoos and trying to make sure that you have 0 visitors versus a full suite of visitors, but certainly trying to encourage the way that you actually look at your controlled experiments. So maybe specific numbers of visitors at different time frames. Maybe you can get different groups to be at certain levels of noise or voice. So that you can kind of monitor that in a little bit more controlled way. And again, also to expand your research. So we do need to think about those amphibians. We do need to think about those invertebrates. And for me, certainly the amphibians, because they had such a negative response, then we need to be thinking about how maybe we can exhibit amphibians in a better way. And again, the information out there on invertebrates was very limited. So overall, when we think about what the current data suggests for our visitor effect, it's pretty neutral, which is good. I think it would be nice if it was positive, but essentially, if our animals in our zoos are just kind of cracking on and getting on with their daily lives without being affected by the visitors, then I think that's very good. One thing that another area that's quite new, that's not a lot of research at the moment been published on, is about the encounters. Now, a paper that's literally in press, we just had the approval and the acceptance last week, so it should be coming to your zoo biology publication soon, is a paper that we looking at exactly that. So how many, within the 𝗬𝗪𝗪 collection, for example, how many interactives or how many experiences are occurring. So 86% of 𝗬𝗪𝗪 collections offered some form of animal visitor interaction, so AVIs. We did include lemur walkthroughs in these, or walkthrough exhibits. So 25 of those, there were 25 different lemur walkthrough exhibits. There were 137 keeper for a day experiences. We had 74% of animal encounters were used with mammals. There was one swim with a sea lion experience as well. So there are an increasing number of interactive experiences. However, various different zoos will market them, but essentially where your visitors become a lot closer contact to an animal than your general standoff barrier and your general visitor will. And one thing that I think is really important here is that we don't actually know much about the impact of these. So what is happening? How are they, how are the animals experiencing these? Are they seeing them as quite positive if it's food related? Or, what is it that they're kind of perceiving? How are they perceiving them? So I think a little bit more research in this area would certainly be welcomed within these experience options, certainly to be able to kind of try and understand the benefits for the animals. Okay, so that's me for the unfamiliar visitors. I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit. I knew I'd get close to running over. Sorry, Ellen. So what about the familiars? So these are obviously the humans that will be working with our zoo animals day in, day out. They will have quite close working relationships with these animals. Some keepers do claim to have bonds with particular individuals and how they perceive a bond. And there's quite, again, a few papers that are available now looking at the human-animal bond. But it might be that kind of little tickle as you walk past, or it could be during a training routine, or it could be even, through education provision. So there's lots of, again, potential interactions that occur between your familiar keepers and your animals. Now, it all started off, this area of research, on the farm, as does most animal welfare research, because generally that's where the funding sits. Not that I'm bitter at all. But as you can see on my wonderful little infographic here, I suppose, when you've got sad or angry farmers working with pigs, the pigs had a decreased growth rate and decreased reproduction levels. And our same angry or similar angry farmers, when they were working with cattle, they had decreases in milk yield, protein and fat. So in terms of the quality of the milk was lower, and increased stress. And this was measured through the milk cortisol. So as you can see, negative aspects impact on production. Now, one thing that we don't really measure and can't really measure in zoos is, first of all, negative interactions, because we don't really encourage them. And most keepers are pretty happy with the animals that they work with. So you're not really going to just happen to come across a really angry, grumpy keeper who doesn't want to be working there with the animals that they're working with. And the other aspect is that we don't measure productivity. So although we might want to look at, or we could potentially look at, breeding outputs, that's generally not really something that we kind of focus on in terms of a welfare element. So the one element that we can focus on are positive aspects, and we can focus on positive behaviours. Again, it's a little bit more easier to monitor. So these sort of keeper animal interactions, they generally started, or research started, in the early 2000s. And it generally focused, again, as you can see, on this positive side of things. So keepers spent 10 minutes more per day with chimpanzees, and the chimpanzees showed a lot more affiliative behaviours towards observers, so potentially visitors. There were trained colobus monkeys, which is the image here. that you can see that I was involved in training, and they were actually, trained for presenting to be able to individually give anthelmintics for worming, and actually as a byproduct of that, the animals were a lot less focused around the visitors and were more focused in around the social groups and the individuals within the environment. So this is quite a very old study, but also an old exhibit that you can see here as well. And gorillas reduced their interactions with the public after a combination of training and play therapy. So this was essentially engaging with the gorillas as a keeper, and they again had more sort of positive interactions with the public as well. So moving on from there, it was quite a time frame. I was then involved with this particular paper that's quite old now, just like me. But looking to see if training has positive effects on the keeper-animal interaction. So we looked at Sulawesi black-crested macaques, we looked at black rhino, and we looked at zebra. And we also wanted to look at fearfulness of humans in zoo animals, and if positive reinforcement training could actually influence this in a positive way, i.e. reduce it. So again, it's quite an old paper. If you're interested in this topic area, you've probably already seen or read this paper, or certainly, I've talked about it in the past. But essentially, the results show that social species have shorter behavioural responses than solitary species, i.e. they responded much quicker, so potentially less fearful because of that kind of group cohesion. The positive reinforcement training reduced the time to perform novel behaviours. So these were behaviours that weren't trained, but actually, again, potentially indicative that training reduces the animal's fear of a human, increasing that positive interaction. And again, the final kind of main summary of this was that that positive reinforcement training, those positive interactions, could actually override a fearful individual's responses of humans. So we put it down to this sort of zoo stockmanship model. So with positive keeper animal interactions, you had positive responses from your animals, which then led into positive animal welfare, which again, generally it leads into a circular approach. So again, those positive animal welfare will probably mean that you're going to have more positive keeper animal interactions. So some work that I did on rats was involved with tickling rats. Now, if you don't know much about tickling rats, go onto YouTube. There's quite a lot of videos and it's very cute. But essentially, there's been research that's shown that tickling rats can emit really positive kind of laughter and enjoyment from rats. So what we wanted to look at was whether, you could engage with various different rats at different levels and how that would impact on their welfare. So we had 3 different groups where no interactions were occurring, no positive interactions were occurring. They were cleaned and fed as per usual. We had where half the group were and where 100% of the group were interacted with and tickled. They were all genetically identical young male lab rats. They were used for a completely different study at a different university, but they hadn't been included in the experimentation. And so we were able to use these rats to be able to do this study and then be able to rehome them as pets afterwards. So interestingly, the fecal glucocorticoids, apologies, the graph little line has just tweaked a little bit there, but essentially was really with no interactions, the FGMs were higher than if they were half of the individuals were removed and handled, or all of the individuals were moved and handled. And so in this case, there was a significant difference between no interactions and all of the individuals being interacted with. On a behavioural response, again, I'm sorry, I'm speeding up a little bit just so I can get through to allow some questions. But again, generally, it was seen that interactions that occurred with the tickling had quite a positive response from the behaviours that were viewed compared to no interactions at all. So again, generally that positive interaction can lead to positive group interactions as well. So it's not necessarily that humans are taking away from the group element, but actually encourage more social play and social interactions between the individuals. We also looked, so my current PhD student, Tom Welsh, also, and I sort of published a paper. This was part of his master's project. And essentially this was looking at if keeper training sessions impacted on mother-calf interactions. So over in an aquarium, I think, across in Europe, forgive me, I can't remember what it was called now. I should have looked that up. 𝗦𝗺, I think it was. But essentially, they had a calf that was born, and the dolphins are part of various different training routines and swim with dolphins and displays. So we wanted to look at how their training sessions impacted on calf interactions. And again, just for time, I'm going to skip through the kind of general results, but essentially there weren't any massive, great big issues that were seen. So there were some highly affiliative behaviours that were seen significantly more after the training. So this could be quite positive, or it also could be seen as that, they're reconnecting afterwards, so it's quite a positive thing. Or it could be that the feeling of the animal or the calf being sort of moved away from the mother during training, so they kind of need that stimulation afterwards. But overall, there wasn't any evidence to suggest that there were negative implications. So actually, those interactions with a positive keeper, a positive training, was quite good for the mother and potentially for the calf. So it'd be quite interesting to go back and see how that calf is now being, if that calf's involved in training and how it's impacted on its training in the future. So in summary, and I'm just looking how much time I've got. Where are we?
You've probably got
Oh,
about
yeah.
5 minutes.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I'll go back to this one then. Okay, so essentially, again, another paper that's now sort of quite old but still relevant, looking at whether there are specific keeper animal dyads that were formed in zoos and looking at whether they change according to different keepers. So again, this is an open access paper that you can all get your hands on if you're interested. But essentially, the results of this particular paper show that some keepers received quicker responses from animals than others, which suggests that there are specific dyads or relationships that are formed between different keepers and different animals. And actually, if the keepers are all behaving the same or doing as they've been trained and doing things in a similar way, then actually it's the animal that's predicting and responding to differently according to the keepers, more so than the keeper having leading on that behavior. So it might be certain qualities, there might be certain things that an animal is picking up on with certain keepers, and that's what then might be looking into, changing that relationship. So again, the idea of a human-animal relationship is a kind of next step on from human-animal interactions. And there have been a few papers that have been published since this work that's kind of looked into that keeper-animal relationship or human-animal relationship in a little bit more detail. Notably, there was a paper in 2008 by, again, 𝗵 𝗪𝗍 looking at whether it's feasible and how they develop and so on and so forth. So what we can see from keeper animal interactions, if I can remember what my clever little imageries mean, but essentially, if keepers are spending more time with animals, it might be that there's more positive behaviours that are provided or seen. With keepers providing positive reinforcement training and treats, it might be that the answer is essentially that we're going to be reducing fearfulness, a scarecrow, get it? In our animals. It doesn't seem to have an impact, or certainly positive reinforcement training doesn't seem to have an impact, certainly within a cetacean or animals that are, quite frequently engaged in training routines. Again, even if you kind of engage positively with half the group, but certainly if you're engaging positively with 100% of the group, then essentially you're going to be improving or potentially improving the welfare. And animals can tell the difference. And I think this for me is one of the big take-home messages is that, they do pick up on your moods, your responses, the way that you're behaving. And so essentially good keeping and positive keeping is probably the way forward. And so if you're going in on when you're not feeling very well, then it might be that you need to maybe be a little bit more hands-off with your animals on that day, because they are able to pick that and pick it up and sense it and make behavioural responses accordingly. And certainly in my own personal experience, it's been more to do with the fact that they just tease you with not going where you want them to go when you need them to go in different places. So overall, the overall impact of the keeper effect is pretty generally quite positive. More time, more positive interactions generally mean that your animals are have better welfare, they respond better, and certainly in terms of behavioural cues, they are behaving more naturally and in a more positive way. There has been a more recent paper, I think it was last year, that started to look at maybe some potentially negative familiar interactions. So looking at veterinary and curatorial, oh my goodness, I can't say, curators engaging with animals during sort of more negative interactions and how that impacts. But it was only sort of one keeper and one vet and one tortoise, I think, if I remember correctly. So a lot more, again, a lot more research needs to be targeted in this particular area. So in summary, what we can suggest is that generally, if you're positive around your animals, happy and in a good mood, as it were, working well, whether it's your visitors or your public, you're going to generally see more positive responses from your animal compared to if you are more negative, maybe angry, frustrated, whatever it might be. And it is interesting to see whether this actually, transfers to animals in the way that we think it might. What's to come? So I mentioned Tom Welsh. He was the student who did the dolphin work. So he's currently investigating implications of human health and well-being and animal welfare during interactive experiences. So he's looking at immersive zoo exhibits, so walkthrough exhibits, and also keep of the day experiences and feeding experiences, and looking at how those particular moments impact on the animals and also impact on the people in terms of their health and welfare for both humans and animals in the same experience. So hopefully we'll be getting some research out there soon about that. Additionally, I'm also working with on some meerkat work at the moment, looking at effect transfer. So if the mood of a keeper transfers through to the mood of an animal, and we're working with meerkats for that particular. So again, keep your eyes peeled for more research in that area. So that is me. Thank you so much. Sorry for the slight rush towards the end. As I said, it's a topic that I really do enjoy talking about and learning about. So there's quite a lot to try and fit into a 45-minute presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. It was a really great presentation. We've got a few questions come through, and if anybody else has got any other questions, then please do send them on. We can invite you to speak, or I can ask them on your behalf. So I'll kick off with one that I've had come through. How would you recommend convincing people that sort of slow and steady building of positive keeper-animal interactions is better than forcing the animals to sort of shift through an area, even though it might be quicker to start with to force the animal to shift through the area?
That's a really great question. I think, to be honest, the evidence the evidence is in the responses. I think slow and steady is always, think of the tortoise and the hare situation. It's always going to win in the long term. And I think it depends on how quickly you need that animal to be in a certain area. If it's for an emergency purpose, then obviously, starting slow and steady, you're already too late. So I think realistically trying to build, animals that might need regular intervention through veterinary care, or if you're training, if animals are moving soon, it might be a good idea to start and train those animals to be able to get used to humans, get used to coming into crates. And there is quite a lot of evidence now that suggests that, certainly from even a behavioural response, that actually a trained animal moving into a crate and closing the door behind it is a much safer animal to move if we're thinking of transporting, for example, than an animal that you've had to, dart and, then wake up in a crate, and it's very scary. And so I think certainly the slow and steady approach to in interactions is definitely the way forward. It depends upon the severity of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, got another one here. So kind of, I guess a little bit related to that. If you're sort of short on time, how do you think it's best to monitor the impacts of visitors, but also the impacts of keepers on the animals? Have you got any top tips for people to when they're sort of thinking about, okay, well, what is this wider impact of my practice and also the visitors being there as well?
Yeah, so I think on the visitors component, I mean, it's difficult these days with the requirements of GDPR, for example, and you know, having CCTV and things like that in your zoo. But I think it is important to be monitoring what visitors are doing. So it might be that your zoo has, you know, a policy to try and include that, you know, you are going to be monitoring your animals and your visitor, you know, standoff barriers and things, just to make sure that for the safety of the visitors and for the safety of the animals. So it might be that you want to look at that within your zoo. Certainly on a keeper's perspective, I think it's ethically, it's quite difficult. And I think this is where the research has struggled, because you need to make sure that your keepers are happy for them to be recorded. So it is their workplace. They do need to feel comfortable working there. And you do need to make sure that, you know, that they don't feel like they're constantly being kind of watched in that sort of way. But I think it is also important for, you know, for safety and those sorts of things as well. So I think being cautious about, you know, how you're monitoring keepers and visitors is important, certainly in today's day and age. But I think it is quite key. So again, look at policies, look at how you might want to, you know, look at this. Generally, I mean, I've been working in zoos for over 20 years now, and I've never met a keeper who's negative towards their animals. It might be that they're negative towards the other staff members, but generally when they're working with the animals, then you know they're normally that way forward. So it's there's obviously exceptions to every rule, but I think just being cautious around what you can and can't film or record in CCTV is important to maintain staff morale as well.
Amazing, thank
I don't
you.
know whether that answered the question, but kind of did.
Yeah, I think so. Um, so sorry, I'm just trying to work out what's gonna go best now. How would you explain the difference between care versus welfare within the context of keeper animal interactions?
Oh, good
Bit
question.
of a big question.
So I believe that care is the kind of the basic level care that what you need for an animal to survive. So I think for me, care is what we always used to see is in zookeepers from when we started off looking after animals. So that's the food, the water, maybe the space, and the ability to be able to kind of, you know, maybe substrate or hay or straw, whatever it might be that they need to be able to kind of, you know, burrow into a bed or something along those lines. Whereas for me, welfare is that element of psychological benefits. So we're allowing them or we're encouraging animals in captivity to be able to perform natural behaviors, feel like they have the opportunity to move away from visitors if they want to, feel like they have choice around their environment. One of the biggest aspects that I see, certainly with the keeper side of things, when we think about choice, is when we're trying to move animals from one enclosure to the other so that we can clean out the opposite enclosure. Now, if both enclosures, you know, are pretty matched in terms of their provisions, then the animals are not going to probably struggle to move from one environment to the other, because they've got all of what's in the same. It's pretty much matched. Whereas if you've got a really small enclosure that's kind of just their holding pen with nothing in there apart from maybe some food that you've put in to try and bribe them in, then essentially the animals are going to struggle to go in there. So they're not going to want to do that. And then you're going to get frustrated as a keeper and your interactions are going to become more negative, and that then becomes this bigger problem. So realistically, what you need to try and do when you're as a keeper is trying to make sure that the areas that you're providing or trying to encourage those animals into are matched as best possible in terms of space and lighting and heat and so on and so forth. So that so the animals choose to move positively more so than being forced.
Yeah, really great. Great answer. And related to that, I've got another question here. Is like, how do you sort of try and cater for the individuals within that? So yeah, when you're sort of thinking about that management, how do you think we should cater for the individuals, especially when we're thinking about like the visitor interactions, the keeper interactions?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. It depends obviously on species. If you've got a solitary individual or solitary animals or pairs, it might be a little bit easier to be able to work things out so that it's a bit more specific. When you're working in larger groups, it's obviously a lot more difficult to try and combine everybody of the group's needs, and certainly when it comes to interactions. So, you might have individuals that are quite scared, quite fearful, quite nervous around the visitors. But I think you just need to try and provide as much as possible. So if you might have confident individuals that come forward, maybe if we're thinking about feeding experiences, for example, it's always the same individuals that come up for, a feed experience. That's fine, as long as the other individuals that don't have quite as much confidence are also provided with maybe the food or whatever it might be that they're getting during that experience. So I think it's trying to be balanced and trying to provide, shelter or shade away from the public, as well as allowing those ones to thrive that do like that interaction.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. I think we've got time just to fit in one more before we finish your grilling. So question. I've lost it. Oh, okay, yeah. So how do you think we can encourage the public to care about their impacts on animals? Because you were saying earlier on that obviously there can be positive, negative, neutral impacts, but if it's a more negative impact, have you got any thoughts as to what we could do within the zoo world to actually get the public to care about what they're doing?
Ban them all. No, I'm obviously kidding. No, so I mean, that's another really great question. I think a lot of the problem with the public is that they don't necessarily know, and they don't think that the animals in zoos are affected negatively by them because they're animals in zoos. Um, they don't understand that them tapping on the glass because they want that photo with that particular animal is going to have a negative impact on that animal or on the experience of that group. So it's about knowledge, I think. And so trying to get as much knowledge as possible to the people, to try and convey those messages. And that might mean a lot more work on the zoo's part, whether that's, having people there talking to people. That might be volunteers, that might be staff, that might be signage. But again, we know that the public generally don't engage as well as we'd like them to with signage. So just trying to engage them in those conversations and allow them to understand the how the animals feel in that situation. And so by engaging them and providing them with that knowledge, then hopefully we're going to make a bit more of a positive difference in that aspect.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And so thank you for a really fabulous webinar. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And there's lots of positive comments coming through in the chat. If your question was not asked, I'm sorry, we just ran out of time. So please do get in touch with Sam. Her email was on that last slide. So you can reach back out to Sam. She'll be able to help you. And this webinar will go up on the YouTube channel. And then we'll share that on our social media channels when it's up. And we will be taking a short break for summer now, but we'll come back with the webinars just after the break. And then again, we'll share those on our social media channels as well. So please do look out for them there.
Thank you very much, and thanks for some great questions.